In the last few months, friends, I've asked you, what are the essential things of the church? What are the things that in times of change we must keep in order to remain meaningful to you and your spiritual journey? And we've spent some time discussing that question together. But I'm conscious that what I haven't done is answer that question for myself. And today, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you why I became a minister. And I'm going to tell you why, after 14 years of teaching piano full-time and fully expecting to retire doing so, why I've returned again to full-time ministry. I want to say that some of what I say you might find controversial or challenging. And I have to say that my views in many ways are very different from some of the views that I've heard. However, I want to emphasize the commitment that I made to you all to maintain and preserve whatever it is that makes our church your spiritual home. But today, I'm going to ask the same commitment of you. I'm going to begin by considering what you look for in a car. When you go out and buy a new car, what is it you're looking for? Are you looking for things like cruise control, leather seats, perhaps climate control, a U-Butte stereo system, a sunroof, or a fancy paint job? These are often the optional extras. You know, you can buy the base model car, or you can upgrade it a little bit if you've got a few more pennies to spend. How is it that you go choosing a car to buy? Well, I've got a couple of suggestions here. Some people go looking for a particular brand or model. The rivalry between Ford owners and Holden owners is well known in Australia. But then you might go looking for a Mercedes or a BMW or an Audi. And myself, if I'm going to buy a car that I particularly want, Pam knows that I would love to buy a Tesla. You might buy a car based on what it's powered by. There's the traditional power of unleaded fuel, diesel fuel. In Australia, there's been gas-powered vehicles for many years. But these days, new technologies are coming available, new ways of powering a car. So we have electricity, we have the hydrogen fuel cell. The thing is that none of these things actually make it a car. Yes, there are options you can buy to add to your car or variants of cars, but none of them actually make it a car. Now, I want you to imagine that you've bought your car and you go and you pick it up at the showroom. You have your fancy leather seats. You have your U-Butte stereo. But the thing that's missing is the engine. You see, without an engine, a car is just not a functional car. And what I'm going to suggest to you today is that the Great Commission is the engine of the church. Without the Great Commission, the church is just not the church. I wonder if you recall what it is Jesus actually taught about the church in the Gospels. Now, if you go to Peter's work, Peter and Paul and the Apostles, you go to the epistles, the second half of the New Testament, you find many, many things written about the church. But what about Jesus in the Gospels? Well, I went looking for the word that we translate as church. And it occurs 3 times, only 3 times in all 4 Gospels. And it's only in 2 verses of Matthew's Gospel that we find that word church. And I'm going to read both of them to you today. The first is this, Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, where Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And the second is this, Matthew chapter 18, verse 17. And it's talking about disputes and controversies here. "And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector." You see, Jesus really doesn't tell us very much about the church. What Jesus does is he establishes the church with his parting words, and those words are the Great Commission. You see, Jesus never said, "Your job is to maintain the church." He never said, "Keep the church going at all costs." He never said, "Whatever happens, the most important thing is business as usual." And the reason he never said that is because the way to maintain the church is to maintain the mission of the church. And that mission is the Great Commission. You can see why this is so fundamentally important to everything that we are and everything that we do. Now, each of the Gospels in their own way end with a commission of a kind. But if you look at them, if you set them side by side, as I have done this week, you can see that they are very, very different. Only Matthew and Mark's Gospel have a passage that we would call, or is labelled, the Great Commission. In Luke's Gospel, what Jesus said is so brief that you almost skip over it. And in John's Gospel, as we heard, it is Peter who receives that commission. And what I want to tell you, even about Matthew and Mark, the 2 Gospels that actually have the commission in them, is the wording is substantially different. So what I'm going to try and do is bring all of those together. And I'm going to bring them together in these 3 words. Go, preach, and baptize. We're going to begin with go. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus is criticised for associating with sinners. And in response to that, he tells 3 parables. There's the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. And in each case, there is action. So in verse 4, in the parable of the lost sheep, Jesus says this, "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it?" In verse 8, the parable of the lost coin. "Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it?" And then in verse 20, the parable of the prodigal son. "So that son, the prodigal son, arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him." Go. There is a change of state demanded. And who is it demanded of? It's demanded of us. We are called to get out of our comfort zones. If we hope for our church to grow in any way, we cannot do it with us sitting down. If we are asking people to change what they do, their habits, their practices, if we're asking them to come into our midst, to do something entirely new that they've never done before, we have to make the first step. The change begins with us. And so we cannot fulfill the Great Commission from the comfort of our armchairs or indeed our pews. Preach. Again, as I said before, the Great Commission in each of the Gospels is very, very different. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew says this. He says, "Make disciples." And a little further on, he says, "Teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you." Now, Matthew's an interesting Gospel in that it is recognized as the Jewish Gospel. And so what he's doing here is replacing one observance, the observance of the law, with the observance of the Great Commission. And Matthew, in many ways, is the most organizational of the Gospels, and it's the most external. Mark, very simply, says, preach the gospel. Luke says, preach repentance and remission of sins. And John, as we heard, talks about feeding and tending his sheep. So we are to preach, or another way of writing it or expressing it is proclaim. And I like that word better because I'm preaching right now. Many of you don't feel that you have the opportunity to preach in the same way that I do, but you can most certainly proclaim the gospel. What did Swedenborg say about the church? Well, he said a couple of things. The first is this: the church resides where the word is, and it owes its existence to the word. Whatever the quality of a person's understanding of the word is, so is the quality of the church in him and the quality of his worship. The church is all about the word. This is why we open the word every time we meet together. Nothing matters as much as the word does. And so when we preach, when we proclaim the gospel, we are proclaiming the word, we are proclaiming divine truth. But Swedenborg said something else about the church too. And this is one example of many. He said, the Lord's church on earth is as the heart, and from it the human race, even that part of it lying outside of the church, has life. You think about your heart and what your heart does, what it is for. Its job is to pump life-giving blood around the rest of your body. And that is what we are supposed to do, friends. We are to take the word and to share it with others. There is no function, no purpose more crucial to us than that. The heart does not and cannot exist for itself. It exists for the rest of the body. We exist for the whole of humanity. And finally, baptize. Swedenborg writes this about baptism. Baptism is the symbol of man's regeneration by the Lord by means of the truths and goods of faith. Not that a person's regeneration is accomplished in baptism, but by the life, the sign of which life is denoted in baptism. Further on, he writes this: baptism was ordained so that it might enable people to call regeneration to to mind. So when the Lord commands us to baptize, it is all about regeneration. It is about spiritual growth and development. I found this lovely description of the word baptism. This is by James Montgomery Boyce. It was written in the Bible Study magazine, May 1989, and he's distinguishing between two words. One is baptism and the other one is dipped. Two very similar Greek words. So, baptizo, which is the Greek word baptism, not to be confused with bapto, which is the word for dipped. He says the clearest example that shows the meaning of baptizo is a text from the Greek poet and physician Nicander, who lived about 200 BC. It's a recipe for making pickles, and it's helpful because it uses both words. Nicander said that in order to make a pickle, the vegetable should first be dipped, bapto, into boiling water, and then baptized, which is baptizo, in the vinegar solution. Both verbs concern the immersing of vegetables in a solution, but the first, dipped, is temporary. The second, the act of baptizing the vegetable, produces a permanent change. And thus we can see why in Luke's Gospel, Luke, the Lord sends the disciples out to preach repentance and the remission of sins, where in Mark's Gospel, the Lord sends the disciples out to baptize. So the church's mission is all about regeneration. It is about change. But it is never about my change only. That would be self-contradictory, because my life cannot ever only be about me, even if I'm talking about my spiritual life. And here is one of the passages that Swedenborg writes to confirm this. A person should be thoroughly concerned about his body, that it should be fed, clothed, and enjoy worldly pleasures. Yet his concern for all these things should not be for his body's sake, but for his soul's. That is to say, his concern should be that his soul may act in a harmonious and proper fashion within a healthy body, so that the body as its organ may respond in perfect obedience to it. Thus the soul must be the end, not the body. Yet the soul must not be the final end, only an intermediate one. For a person must be concerned about his soul, not for its own sake, but for the services it must perform in both worlds. When a person has those services as his end in view, he has the Lord as his end. Finally, friends, I want to say that this is not my job. This is our job. Church is not and never should be a spectator sport. If I am going to be the only one consciously engaged in this work, then the church is already dead. So your task out of all of this week is very simple. I'm asking you to join me. I'm asking you to email me, to call me, if the Great Commission calls out to you and drives your Christianity. I want to hear your hopes and dreams for our church. I want to hear the ways you feel we can reach out together and serve those around us. Now, you may not know what it is you can do. You may not know what contribution you can make. But let me tell you that every single person does make a contribution, can make a positive contribution to this mission. We just must do it consciously and together. And it can be as simple as sitting and listening to someone coming through your front door and sharing with you their troubles. Something as simple as making someone feel welcome. I've made the commitment to you, and I maintain it, that whatever it is that makes our organisation a church for you, we will continue to do. I'm asking you to join me in my mission, because I can tell you that nothing will excite me more than being able to work with a group of people to take the word, to take the teachings of our church out to a world that I believe desperately needs it.